I grew up, like many of you I think, loving the comic strip characters from Peanuts. Most of us remember them. One enduring factor is that Peanuts often featured the topic of love. Once upon a time, Lucy told Charlie Brown, "You know what I don't understand? I don't understand love." And Charlie Brown simply replied, "Who does?" Lucy blurted back, "Explain love to me, Charlie Brown." And Charlie Brown thoughtfully answered, "You can't explain love. I can recommend a book or a poem or a painting, but I can't explain love." Lucy wouldn't let Charlie Brown off the hook. Well, try, Charlie Brown, try. And so he tried. Well, let's say I see this beautiful, cute little girl walk by. Lucy loudly interrupted, "Why does she have to be cute, huh? Why can't someone fall in love with someone with freckles and a big nose? Explain that." Charlie Brown said, "Well, maybe you're right. Let's just say I see this girl walk by with this great big nose." "I didn't say great big nose," Lucy shouted. And Charlie Brown's last line is, "You not only can't explain love, you can't even talk about it." The wonderful thing about Charlie Brown and his friends is that they seem to get life. They really state it well in simple and often funny, but powerful ways. It's a brilliant genius, Charles Schulz, who put that together. And Charlie Brown, in this story that I just told you, is trying to address romantic love. But his statement holds true for any love. When it comes right down to it, you not only can't explain love, you can't even talk about it. At least not without dissent. And Jesus was in the business of being a love monger. A monger is someone who deals in a specific commodity, and Jesus' commodity was and is love. And I like to think that Christians and churches are supposed to be in the business of being love mongers too, dealing the same commodity as Jesus, love. Love is a word that most of us like to think about and hear. It's a commodity that we all want and all need. But it's not only hard to explain it, it's a difficult commodity to explain. It's often also one that's hard to talk about. Talking about love can lead to dissent. Advocating for love can be divisive. You wouldn't think so, but it is. And hear me clearly, no one has to agree with a pastor in this church, so feel free to dissent from this sermon. We encourage folks here to think openly. And my point is not to get you to agree with me, but that the topic of love is not an easy one. We talk about love every week in this church because it is at the center of our faith. Love is at the heart of this church's life. It is the focus of our faith because we believe that God is love and because Jesus declared that loving God and loving self and others are the greatest commandments. Simply put, if Christianity is done right, nothing trumps love. Love wins. It's the ace, it's the linchpin, the whole enchilada, the queen and king of our way of being. And 2 weeks ago, and on many other occasions, we heard from this pulpit how love is defined in the theological dictionary as a strong feeling of personal affection, care, and the desire for the well-being of others. A primary characteristic of God's nature and a supreme expression of Christian faith and action. That's the kind of love that Paul is talking about in the lesson we just heard from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. That love chapter is pretty famous. In the past few weeks, I have read it aloud 3 times in public. Once at a funeral and twice at weddings. It's a lovely, lovely ode to love, and I love that it's popular. And because it often stands alone, we usually forget, though, that the text is from a letter that is calling to account the poor behavior of a church in Corinth. Paul is, in fact, asserting that love is positively not what they are doing at their church, and that, as a matter of fact, love exactly all the things that they are failing to do. Paul's not saying we can be perfect in love, but by loving we do not become God. None of us are God. None of us are pure love. Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 13 isn't to not fail to be loved all the time, but rather to know that love is the plumb line by which we measure the church that we build. It's what we aim to be and what we know not to be. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. I'm reading a book by Michael Piazza about renewing progressive churches like ours. And Reverend Piazza notes that a whole bunch of Americans love Jesus but have lost faith in the church. A whole bunch of Americans love Jesus but have lost faith in the church. And Piazza, in essence, asks, who can blame them? And he points out that progressive church complacency is one of the culprits of this lost faith in the church. He writes with painful frankness that because progressive people too often have failed to speak loudly or effectively in the face of bigotry, discrimination, and oppression on national platforms, the Christianity that most people think of stands against rather than for the positions about which moderates and progressives care most. And a dear friend of mine in this church pointed out last week that I need to be careful with the word progressive because it has political connotations as well as theological connotations. Reverend Piazza and I use the term not to describe liberal progressive politics, but to describe a Christian theology that advocates love as paramount, a theology which simply put takes Jesus' teaching that loving God and loving neighbors is above all the other commands in the Bible. In progressive theology, love trumps all, even other parts of the Bible, if warranted. Progressive theology emphasizes compassion and care and desire for the well-being of others. And it understands that action on those things is critical. And so social justice issues matter. And they matter much. You can be a progressive Christian and also a politically conservative person or a liberal or a socialist or a green or a libertarian or a Democrat or a Republican. Progressive Christianity is about believing in love and loving. It's not about political doctrines. In progressive church, love is at the heart of the church's life, not this political litmus test or that. Reverend Piazza, a progressive Christian pastor, notes that recently 2 evangelical writers were shocked to discover that most young Americans perceive all Christians to be hypocritical, soul-saving, anti-homosexual, sheltered, judgmental, political activists. And Reverend Piazza concludes that while we as progressives can say, thank goodness that is not us, we have to acknowledge that no one would actually know that it isn't, because we too often abdicate our voice to the more conservative, radical, and outrageous among us. And Reverend Piazza produces evidence detailing the reasons young adults are staying away in droves from all churches. He lists facts I've more or less seen and argued, but they are still stunning to see and hear all piled together. Only 16% of 16 to 29-year-olds have a favorable view of church. Only 16%. 16%. And this is why, Piazza writes, they don't like the church. 91% think it is anti-gay, and they are not. 87% say it is too judgmental. 85% say it is hypocritical. 78% say it is old-fashioned. 75% say it is too involved in conservative politics. 70% say it is insensitive to those who are different. 68% say it is boring. 64% say it is not accepting of people of other faiths. These are 21st century facts progressive churches must face or risk fading away. Far from being perceived as loving, whether it is fair or not, all Christian churches are perceived to most of the country as not having a strong feeling of personal affection, care, and the desire for well-being of others. We are seen from afar as not being about love, even though that is the very heart of our way of being as church, of our understanding of Jesus' way to relationship to God, to relationship with others, and to relationship with all of creation. Progressive churches like ours do not have a theology that is anti-gay. By and large, progressive churches are not judgmental, insensitive, hypocritical, or unaccepting. Our theology is not unloving. Yet that is how folks who have not walked through the doors of our church understand us. These facts break my heart, and they should break your heart too. They are affecting our ministries and our missions, our attendance, and our offerings. We have been lumped together with the churches that have gladly raised the banner in the media and in books and in worship and out on the streets of being anti-gay, judgmental, hypocritical, insensitive to those who are different, and not accepting people of other faiths. That is decidedly not us. We really and truly are perceived as being such, nonetheless, by a vast majority of people. That's a very sad fact. And while the United Church of Christ may be the opposite of what churches are perceived as, we carry some of the blame as a whole for letting our church get tainted by the ugliness of churches that are not love-centered. Our fault is, as Reverend Piazza points out, because progressive people too often have failed to speak loudly or effectively in the face of bigotry, discrimination, and oppression. And this is not just Reverend Piazza and me that have this view. No less a theologian and saint of the church than Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. held this view and predicted church would suffer the losses in droves it is now experiencing. That great pastor made his prediction 60 years ago. 60 years ago. In prophetic words about the church that ring eerily true today. Today marks the start of the first week of Black History Month. A month we cannot help but recall the terrible oppression imposed on African Americans in our nation. A Christian nation. And make no mistake about it, oppression of minorities, including African Americans, continues. Injustices sadly still exist. Reverend Dr. King wrote in 1963, "So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silence and often even vocal sanction of things as they are." The King goes on to write, "But the judgment of God is upon the church. as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. In 21st Century Facts that Reverend Piazza provides mesh with Reverend King's observation. Reverend King was appalled at moderation in church when it came to civil rights. He notes in his letter from a Birmingham jail, "I must make two confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with a white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with you in your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Those 50-year-old words of Reverend King's address a part of love that we can't, won't, or have a very hard time talking about in our churches. It's truth that affects the church, even today, on civil rights issues of the press. It's easier not to have tension than to advocate for the presence of justice. Justice for African Americans. Justice for people of color. Justice for aliens. Justice for the poor. Justice for the sick. Justice for the imprisoned. Justice for lesbian, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders. Justice for the disabled. Justice for the elderly. Justice for child laborers. Justice for the enslaved. Justice for women. Justice for those of other faiths. All of those forms of justice require that love advocates love. That is, we speak and we plead and we argue in words and deeds with love for justice for all. It is easier to say we care about the well-being of others than to take direct action. It is easier to talk the talk than to walk the walk. In order for love to advocate love, love needs a voice. It needs legs, and it needs arms. We are what love needs. Our action is love's action. We are God's actors. We are God's actors. And the effects of inaction were predicted by Reverend King 50 years ago, and they are borne out by facts today. People are leaving. We're not coming to progressive churches, not just because we are misunderstood, but because we are often lukewarm in the world with love. Talking the talk is not walking the walk. A warm reception for the idea of love is not hot pursuit of it. I want to point out that Reverend King's words about lukewarm acceptance in the church losing God's support has biblical backing. In Revelation 3, we're told what Jesus thinks of churches that are only warm about love. Jesus says, I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. Moderation in love is not Jesus' way. Jesus' way is about advocating love in word and deed. Love advocates love. Jesus was not moderate in his passion or boldness. Neither was Paul. And the reason is that neither is love. God, love advocates love. God, love is all about action. It rejoices in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. One commentary on today's text notes that Paul is speaking about agape, a form of love. Agape, the love most visible in God's love for humankind in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This love is not, in the first instant, a feeling, but an action. This love seeks not its own good, but the good of the one who is love. Last spring, we voted without a single vote in opposition to adopt a strategic plan. Last Sunday, we voted to speed up the implementation of that plan. And that plan's over there on the wall. It is in the shape of an arrow. And the point of that arrow states Riviera United Church of Christ's purpose is to exist, to experience, and share Christ's unconditional love by thinking openly, believing passionately, and serving boldly. And on that plan, we, this church, intentionally aim that purpose at 5 dynamic ministries: progressive theology ministries, non-traditional ministries, multi-generational ministries, crisis needs ministries, cultural diversity ministries. And if we pursue each of those not warmly, but with hot pursuit that is open, passionate, and bold, we will engage in the very act of Christ's unconditional love. And I believe, and you may disagree with me, that a huge part of that has got to be the church and each of us proclaiming out loud that we are a love-centered church and that we believe and practice Jesus' way of love, advocating love, aiming for justice and peace in action, not just in word. Progressive churches need to no longer fail, to borrow Reverend Piazza's words, to speak loudly or effectively in the face of bigotry, discrimination, and oppression. Or, as Reverend Dr. King puts it, we cannot be more devoted to order than to justice. We must become seekers of a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Nancy told you there's a meeting being held between both services next Sunday to discuss how to best further implement that wonderful strategic plan and get it running now under the budget that we voted on last week. How can we best be love, advocating love? Your input and your action matter. They are critical in answering that question. Please plan to attend 10 a.m. next Sunday to help this church best exist, to experience and share Christ's unconditional love by thinking openly and believing passionately and serving boldly. Attend, please. We need all people connected to this community involved and direct action from everyone to get the word out that love is at the heart of the life of this awesome church community. We decided last week that all of us would run hard to transform the church. The meeting next week is the starting line. Love is how we intend to run. And peace and justice are at the finish line. Amen.